But then came the detail Ethan had been waiting for. Daniel had been born in late April, making him a Taurus. The killer really was following the zodiac order, and that realization made Ethan's heart pound. If the killer continued through the signs one by one, he might already know who his next target was. That was the most terrifying part. The killer was choosing people not based on personal conflict, but based on a pre-planned system that no one could predict. Anyone who matched the next sign could be marked for death without ever knowing it. The media exploded the next morning. Reporters packed the police station demanding answers. Anchors debated whether Silver Creek was dealing with a serial killer obsessed with astrology. Residents flooded the department with calls, begging for protection, pleading for guidance, and some simply panicking. Ethan hated media chaos, but he understood it was unavoidable. The town had gone from peaceful to paranoid in just 14 days, and the fear was only growing. The mayor held an emergency meeting with police leaders, promising full support and immediate resources. Patrols were doubled, community centers opened late to provide safe spaces, and neighborhood watch groups sprang up overnight. But Ethan knew that none of it would matter unless they understood the killer's motive. And right now, he had nothing but symbolism and silence. Back in the station, Ethan formed a dedicated task force to investigate the murders. Analysts studied the zodiac signs, psychologists examined the short messages, and officers interviewed anyone connected to the victims. Ethan's whiteboard filled with timelines, personality profiles, forensic evidence, and possible theories. But the one thing he needed most, a clear motive, was still missing. While studying crime scene footage from Daniel's workshop, Ethan replayed the security camera feed repeatedly. At 11:47 p.m., a figure in a hooded jacket slipped silently inside. The camera angle was poor, and most of the face was shadowed, but Ethan zoomed in on the walk. Slow, balanced, controlled. The killer was not scared. The killer had done this before. Ethan paused the footage, feeling frustration and grim determination tightening inside him. The killer wasn't acting like someone making impulsive choices. He was calm, organized, and confident. He knew when to come and go. He had not left anything behind accidentally. That meant he had prepared for this for a long time. Perhaps years. The task force began digging into Rachel's and Daniel's backgrounds. It took days of combing through personal histories, community records, and digital data before a small pattern began to emerge. Rachel had once been involved in a minor scandal at a charity event where money had gone missing. She had never been charged, but whispers had followed her for months. Daniel had once been responsible for a workplace accident that had caused severe damage to the shop and cost another mechanic his job. Both events were years old, largely forgotten, and not severe enough to explain murder. But Ethan suddenly saw the possibility. The killer might not be selecting targets only because of their birth dates. He might be selecting people he believed had escaped punishment for something. People who had been given second chances by society. Ethan sat at his desk, staring at the file spread before him as a chilling hypothesis formed. The zodiac was not the motive. The zodiac was the structure. The motive might be judgment. The more Ethan thought about it, the more the idea made sense. The killer might feel that society had allowed guilty people to walk free. He might believe that justice needed to come from him, not the law. But to think of himself as some agent of cosmic punishment meant the killer was deeply delusional. And delusional killers did not stop until their mission was complete. Every minute that passed tightened the knot in Ethan's stomach. The killer had moved from Aries to Taurus. That meant Gemini was next. Ethan had already compiled a list of local residents born between late May and June. There were dozens. Teachers, nurses, construction workers, students, retirees, business owners. Any one of them could be the next victim, or none of them could be. The killer might not even be living in Silver Creek, could travel freely, could already be watching his next target. One thing was certain. The killer was not slowing down. After the press conference, Ethan returned to the empty observation room, shut the door behind him, and looked again at the two messages pinned to the evidence board. First sign. Second sign. They represented more than murders. They were steps in a ritual. Steps the killer had been planning far before the police even realized what had begun. Ethan stood alone in the room and whispered the question that had been haunting him since the second body was found. How many more would die before they stopped him? He knew that time was already slipping away. And the stars, at least in the killer's mind, had already moved toward the next sign. Silver Creek had always been the kind of town people moved to when they wanted peace. It was known for quiet neighborhoods, seasonal festivals, and a sense of community that hadn't changed in decades. Children rode bicycles to school without fear. Elderly neighbors tended their flower gardens, and on warm evenings families gathered outside to share lemonade and stories. That was why the murder of Rachel Myers hit the town like a violent storm. Nothing like this ever happened here. Until that night, Silver Creek had been the kind of place where police work mostly involved breaking up noise complaints or helping a stranded driver change a tire. All of that changed when 911 received a call after midnight from a neighbor who had heard screams coming from Rachel's backyard. Officers arrived expecting perhaps a domestic dispute, but what they found was something far more frightening. Detective Ethan Ward was awakened by the dispatcher's call at 1:14 a.m. He dressed quickly, grabbed his badge and notebook, and drove through the silent streets toward Maple Avenue, attempting to prepare himself for whatever waited at the scene. Ethan had worked in larger cities before transferring to Silver Creek, and although he had handled difficult cases in the past, this one felt different even before he arrived. Maybe it was the tone in the dispatcher's voice or the knowledge that every major event in Silver Creek spread through word of mouth before the sun rose. Whatever it was, Ethan felt unsettled before he even stepped out of his car. The backyard was cordoned off with yellow tape, and the flashing blue and red lights painted the surrounding houses in nervous color. As Ethan ducked under the tape, he immediately sensed the shock among the officers present. Some stood motionless, others whispered among themselves, but all shared the same wide-eyed look of disbelief. In a town as calm as this, murder was a nightmare scenario, and what they had found was worse than anything they expected. Rachel Myers lay beside her patio steps, her body carefully arranged, not dropped or abandoned. Her eyes were closed, her arms placed gently at her sides, and even in the dim floodlights, Ethan could see that whoever had done this had taken their time. There was no sign of panic or chaos. The scene was controlled, calculated. What unsettled Ethan most was how peaceful she looked, as if the killer wanted her death to appear almost ceremonial. Then Ethan noticed the carved shape on the wooden fence. A symbol, etched with precision, stood out sharply in the wood. At first it looked like a simple geometric drawing, but after a moment Ethan recognized it. Aries, the zodiac sign for people born in late March and most of April. It was so unexpected and out of place that Ethan had to stare for a moment before looking away. Murders were one thing, but symbolic messages were something entirely different. They suggested a killer who wanted to be understood, or perhaps one who wanted to be feared. Ethan continued studying the scene, and soon found another detail. On the back step of Rachel's house, a small envelope rested perfectly scented as if placed with intention. The wax seal was dark red, stamped with a simple circular impression. One of the crime scene technicians handed it to Ethan carefully. Inside, written in neat handwriting, were two words, first sign. There was no signature, no taunt, nothing dramatic. Just the message of someone who believed that this was only the beginning. Ethan pocketed the note, and his mind began to wake. Was this the killer's way of announcing a series? Was he promising more? If so, how many? And why Rachel? He walked through the yard, looking for signs of forced entry, footprints, fingerprints, anything that might indicate a struggle, but there was almost nothing. No signs of panic, no torn grass, no overturned furniture. The killer had moved quietly, confidently, and left without rushing. Ethan found that deeply unsettling. If the murderer had been nervous or unsure, he would have made mistakes. Instead, the scene looked almost staged. That level of control meant the killer had thought this through long before stepping onto the property. When the coroner arrived, Ethan stepped away and stood near the fence, staring again at the RE symbol. He tried to imagine the killer carving it into the wood, taking the time to make it precise. Was it meant to confuse the police? Or did it represent something personal, something only the killer understood? Ethan took a deep breath, reminded himself that cases did not get solved by speculation alone, and walked toward the house to start interviews. Inside, Rachel's living room was tidy and warm. Photographs of family gatherings sat framed on shelves, showing smiling faces and birthday parties. Rachel's neighbors described her as kind and gentle, the sort of person who brought soup to sick friends and organized food drives at the church. Nobody could imagine her having enemies. She taught piano to children in the community and rarely missed a holiday gathering. Her death made no sense to anyone. Ethan sat with a younger sister, Emily, who had arrived after receiving the heartbreaking call. She was distraught, unable to understand how something so horrible could happen to someone so harmless. When Ethan asked whether Rachel had been worried about anything recently, Emily shook her head. She said Rachel had been excited about the upcoming holidays and had even planned to bake cookies the next morning. There was no sign she had expected anything unusual. Ethan asked about Rachel's personal life. Was she dating anyone? Had she been feuding with someone? Had she received threats? Emily hesitated before mentioning that Rachel had been feeling uneasy for a few days but hadn't explained why. She said Rachel had brushed it off, believing she was simply stressed from preparing for a charity concert she was helping organize. Emily didn't know that this small detail would later become very important. After hours of interviews, it was nearly sunrise when Ethan finally stepped outside. The early morning fog clung to the ground, and the lights from the crime scene blurred softly in the damp air. The neighborhood was silent except for the murmured voices of officers finishing their reports. Ethan stood at the edge of the yard, staring again at the carved Zodiac sign. He had a sinking feeling that this was not the end. It didn't feel like a crime of passion or revenge. It felt like the beginning of something carefully planned. On the drive back to the station, Ethan replayed everything in his mind. The killer had chosen Rachel for a reason. The message didn't feel random. If first sign meant what Ethan feared, then the killer might intend to follow the Zodiac order, targeting victims based on their birthdays. A chilling thought followed. If there were 12 Zodiac signs, how many more people were in danger? Ethan arrived at the station as dawn touched the sky with pale color. He stepped into his office and placed the red-sealed note on the desk, reading the words again. First sign. It felt like the killer was speaking directly to him, challenging him, daring him to follow the trail. Ethan knew he could not let fear guide his thoughts. He needed facts. He began reviewing Rachel's background, financial records, community involvement, and personal history, hoping to find something that could explain why she had been chosen. But nothing immediately stood out. As the sun rose, casting light through his office window, Ethan realized that whatever was coming next, Silver Creek was not prepared. The town had lived peacefully for too long, trusting that terrible things happened only in distant cities. But somewhere in Silver Creek, a killer had already decided what would happen next. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, knowing that the next few days would determine whether he could stop the nightmare before it continued. Deep down, though, he feared the truth. The killer had started something bigger than a single murder, and Ethan was facing an unknown enemy who believed in a greater plan. The first sign had already been written in blood, and Silver Creek's peace was shattered. The real question that kept Ethan awake was not who the killer was, but how soon they planned to strike again. 2 weeks passed, yet Silver Creek had not begun to heal. The flowers placed outside Rachel Meyer's home had started to wilt, and the news vans that crowded the neighborhood had finally rolled away. But the fear lingered like a shadow over the town. People double-checked their locks, installed new security cameras, and avoided walking alone after dark. Even the children sensed that something had changed, though they could not understand what. The silence that settled over the town felt heavy, as if everyone was waiting for the next terrible thing to happen. Detective Ethan Ward certainly was. He had been reviewing Rachel's case every day, trying to find the connection that would unlock the truth, but answers were scarce. The killer had left almost nothing behind. No fingerprints, no DNA, no evidence suggesting how he entered or escaped. The only clues were the carved RE symbol and the note that said first sign, and those clues had revealed far more questions than answers. Ethan wanted to believe the killer might stop at one murder, but deep down, he knew better. The level of planning, the symbolism, the confidence at the scene. No one put that much intention into a single act. The killer wanted to make a statement. Ethan learned just how true that was when his phone rang shortly after midnight. Another body had been found. He drove through the quiet streets with sirens off, not wanting to wake the town, though the dread in his chest kept him wide awake. This time, the location was on the industrial side of Silver Creek, in a small auto repair shop owned by Daniel Brooks, a local mechanic in his mid-30s. The shop lights were still on, illuminating the entrance with a cold, buzzing glow. Officers stood just inside the garage doorway, their faces pale and shaken. Ethan braced himself before stepping in. Daniel Brooks lay beside a toolcat, his body positioned carefully, just like Rachel's. His expression was peaceful, his hands resting near his sides, and beside him on the concrete floor Someone had painted a large symbol in black, another zodiac sign. Ethan crouched beside it, recognizing it instantly. Taurus. That was when the pressure in his chest became something colder, something heavier. This wasn't only happening again, it was happening in order. Aries, then Taurus. The killer was following the zodiac wheel. While forensics got to work, Ethan inspected the scene. Again, there was no struggle, no overturned furniture, no desperate marks on the ground. Daniel had likely never seen his attacker coming. The wax-sealed envelope was waiting, placed neatly on the workbench as if the killer wanted to make sure it was found quickly. Ethan opened it and read the words inside. Second sign. That was all. No threats, no explanations, no apology. Just another short announcement, like a diary entry documenting the killer's progress. As Ethan stared at the message, he felt something new, anger. He was being taunted, and the killer knew it. Daniel's co-workers gathered outside the building as the body was removed. They spoke in hushed voices, not only because of grief but because of fear. If the killer was choosing victims based on zodiac birthdays, then no one knew who might be next. Ethan interviewed Daniel's younger brother, who arrived at the scene trembling and speechless. Once calm enough to talk, he told Ethan that Daniel was dependable, hardworking, and not the type to get into trouble. He had been working late on a customer's car, something he often did, and nothing about the day had seemed unusual. Daniel had not received threats, had no known enemies, and was well liked in the community. The third murder came even faster than anyone feared. Silver Creek had barely finished recovering from the shock of Daniel Brooks' death when a new emergency call hit the police station late on a Wednesday evening. Ethan was in his office, surrounded by papers, timelines, witness statements, and psychological profiles, trying desperately to connect the dots. Sleep had become a luxury he could no longer afford. His desk lamp cast a warm circle of light in the dim room as he read through the forensic reports again and again, looking for the mistake he might have missed. His mind was sharp, but his heart was growing heavier with every passing hour. He knew the killer was planning the next move. He also knew he was running out of time. Then his phone rang, and the voice on the other end said the words he'd been dreading. "We found another one." Ethan drove to Redwood Elementary School, tires humming against the cold pavement. The campus sat dark and quiet, its playground empty, the classrooms locked for the night. At first glance nothing seemed disturbed, but when he entered the school's main hallway, the grim atmosphere told him everything he needed to know. Officers guided him toward a classroom piano music room, and when he stepped inside, he saw the third victim, Lily Anderson, positioned in a chair at the front of the room. She was still wearing her school jacket, hands placed neatly in her lap, her face calm. Everything looked almost peaceful except for the chilling chalk drawing on the board behind her. Gemini, another zodiac symbol, drawn in clean white lines across the green chalkboard. The killer had taken the time to draw it with precision, just like carving Aries into Rachel's fence and painting Taurus at Daniel's shop. Ethan scanned the room slowly. Again, there were no signs of struggle, no signs of forced entry, no dropped items that suggested panic. The only deliberate disturbance was the symbol and the note taped under Lily's desk. He pulled it free and unfolded it carefully. Third sign. The stars demand justice. Unlike the first two messages, this one carried a meaning beyond simple identification. It was a justification, a declaration of purpose. The killer wasn't just cataloging murders. He believed he was carrying out some form of cosmic sentencing. Ethan read the sentence again and again, his stomach cold. This wasn't just murder. This was ritual. As investigators moved through the room dusting for prints, photographing the scene, and collecting fibers, Ethan walked the perimeter slowly, his eyes tracing every detail. He was trying to see the room not as a detective but as the killer might have seen it. What kind of person could kill a schoolteacher in such a quiet room, surrounded by children's drawings taped to the walls and tiny paper snowflakes cut out and taped to the windows? Who could look at the piano, the rows of small desks, the chalkboard with lesson notes still scribbled on one corner, and still go through with something so calculated? The answer, Ethan knew, was someone who believed they were entirely right. The school principal arrived shortly after, her face pale and her hands trembling as she leaned against the doorframe. She could hardly speak as Ethan asked her questions. Lily had stayed late that evening to finish grading homework and preparing music sheets for the next week's recital. Nothing unusual. Lily was known for being dedicated, kind, and patient. She had no enemies, no disciplinary complaints, no personal issues that anyone knew about. She was the kind of teacher parents trusted completely. As the principal tried to compose herself, Ethan looked down at his notebook, and a question formed there like a bruise he didn't want to press. Why Lily? The answer didn't come until much later, after Ethan visited Lily's home and spent hours searching for anything that might shine light on her selection. He checked her computer, her mail, her letters, and everything seemed as ordinary as she was. Then he noticed a small envelope taped underneath her kitchen table. Someone had placed it there intentionally and carefully, almost hidden unless someone knew to look for it. Inside was a newspaper clipping from 5 years earlier. It showed a picture of a damaged school bus and a headline about a brake failure on a field trip. Several students had been injured, and fear had swept the town. Lily had been the teacher in charge of that trip. Though she had been cleared of any wrongdoing, the killer seemed to think differently. Ethan held the clipping in his hand and felt a rush of dread. The killer was not selecting victims randomly. He was choosing people he saw as guilty of hidden sins, mistakes, or moral failures that society had forgiven or forgotten. Ethan drove straight to the station and spread the 3 victim profiles out before him. Rachel with the charity scandal, Daniel with the workplace fire, Lily with the school bus accident. 3 separate people, 3 separate mistakes, but all tied together by the same idea. The killer believed justice had not been served. And if the killer believed the justice system, or the world itself, was failing, then he might feel obligated to carry out justice personally. Ethan looked up at the notes. First sign. Second sign. Third sign. The stars demand justice. He realized this was not revenge in the usual sense. It was doctrine. Philosophy. A belief system so deeply rooted that the killer was willing to kill strangers for it. The next morning, Ethan brought in criminal psychologists to analyze the letters and pattern. They listened carefully as he presented the evidence, and their conclusions felt like a weight dropping in his stomach. They said the killer showed signs of a complex delusion. He was likely intelligent, high-functioning, and convinced he was serving a higher universal purpose. He wasn't killing out of rage or pleasure. He was acting like someone fulfilling responsibility. This meant he would be extremely difficult to predict or persuade. He would kill again not because he wanted to, but because he believed he had to. The psychologists also pointed out the precision of the symbols and letters. The killer was patient and controlled, suggesting years of emotional buildup. He had not suddenly snapped. He had planned this. The question was, how long had he been preparing, and how many names were already on his list? Ethan rubbed his forehead, exhaustion weighing on him. He went over Lily's timeline. She had stayed late at school alone, meaning the killer had known her schedule. He had either been following her or knew intimate details of her life. That level of familiarity suggested someone from inside the community, someone trusted, someone who could move unnoticed. That realization chilled Ethan even more. The killer was not an outsider. He was one of them. Ethan began cross-referencing the backgrounds of the 3 victims, looking for common social circles, professional links, shared locations, anything that might help. After several hours, something small caught his attention. The victims had all attended the same community counseling program years ago. At first it seemed insignificant. Many residents had gone through that program, especially during tough economic years. But Ethan dug deeper and found that the counselor overseeing their sessions was a man named Dr. Adrian Cole. Respectable, soft-spoken, widely admired in town. If he had been present in each victim's life during their lowest moments, then he would have known their secrets, their confessions, their guilt. Ethan didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the possibility made his heart race. Someone who knew the private failings of each victim would be the perfect architect for a moral crusade. The one person who would know who had fallen short, who had made mistakes, and who, in the killer's twisted view, deserved cosmic judgment. But before Ethan could act on this suspicion, he received word that Lily's mother had arrived at the station to give a statement. When Ethan met her, she held a small notebook in her hands, Lily's journal. She said Lily often wrote reflections on her students and school life. Ethan flipped through the pages, and one entry caught his attention. Lily had written that someone had left a note in her mailbox a few days earlier. It said simply, "Justice cannot sleep forever." She had assumed it was a prank and thrown it away. Ethan sat back in his chair, chilled by what that meant. The killer had been warning her, watching her, preparing her death. Ethan closed the journal and stood quietly, staring out the window of the station. The school where children had recited songs and played instruments had turned into a murder scene. A schoolteacher known for her kindness was gone, not because of personal hatred, but because someone believed the universe required it. That realization changed everything. If the killer believed he was correcting the scales of fate, then no one who had ever been forgiven, overlooked, or socially absolved was safe. The murder spree was not random. It was systematic. As the night deepened, Ethan found himself alone in the evidence room. He looked at the 3 case files lined up side by side. Then he looked at the zodiac wheel pinned above them, with the first 3 signs crossed out. Aries, Taurus, Gemini. The killer was moving along the zodiac calendar. Cancer was next. Ethan pressed his palms against the table, feeling the weight of the truth. Someone out there was counting down the stars. And unless he stopped them, more innocent people with old mistakes would die. The killer's mission wasn't finished. He had only just begun. Detective Mark Weller had spent almost a decade chasing shadows, but nothing compared to the complexity of the Zodiac case. Every new clue tied itself into a knot. Every discovery opened doors only to reveal another dead end. Yet as the summer sun burned over California, something was changing. A feeling had begun to build in him, a sense that the killer was getting careless. It was not arrogance or hopefulness. It was instinct, the same instinct that had once made him one of the most promising young detectives on the force. Now, sitting in a dim briefing room surrounded by stacks of files, photos, and fragments of handwritten letters, Weller stared at the latest cipher and felt something crack inside him. This time, he was close. The latest Zodiac letter had arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle 3 days ago. Unlike the previous ones, it contained not a single threat, not even a demand. It was taunting in a different way. It read as if the killer were writing to himself, confessing something he had never admitted before. Not to the police, not to the press, not even to his victims. In one passage, he wrote that sometimes the greatest thrill was not the kill but the silence afterward, the moment the world held its breath waiting for answers that would never come. Weller read that line again and again. This wasn't just a message. It was a slip, a psychological crack, and Weller was determined to pry it open. The detectives had spent days trying to decipher the coded message attached to the letter, a sheet filled with cryptic symbols arranged in precise columns. The code breakers on the case worked tirelessly, but one symbol kept recurring, a small triangle with a dot in the center. Only Weller seemed to sense that the symbol meant something personal, something geographical. He went back through every map referenced in previous letters, through old police reports and crime scene photos, searching for a pattern. Hours turned into a full day, then a night. But at dawn, hunched over his desk with tired, burning eyes, it revealed itself. The symbol matched a coordinate marking on an old Army topographic map from 1959. It was not a location used anymore, not on current maps, but the coordinates placed it outside Napa County, right near a cluster of abandoned buildings and what had once been a National Guard training site. He didn't wait to call for backup. He knew the cautious thing would have been to gather a team, organize a structured search and follow all requirements, but he also knew that involving too many people risked losing the moment. If the killer was indeed using the site, even just as a symbolic drop point or ritual space, there was no telling how long it would remain untouched. Weller grabbed his coat, tucked the letter into his inside pocket and got into his car, the early morning fog creeping low over the highway as he drove north. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. The road was empty. No other cars, no distractions, just him and the echo of his thoughts. He kept replaying every line in the letter. There were hints everywhere, fragments of guilt, suggestions of returning to old places. It was as if the Zodiac was circling back to the beginning, reliving something. By the time Weller reached the forest perimeter, the sun had barely risen. The abandoned National Guard site had long since been cordoned off by the county as hazardous land, with rusted fences leaning sideways and warning signs faded by time. Weller parked just outside and walked in on foot, pushing through tall grass and overgrown trails. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became, until the only sound was the wind whistling through broken windows and loose metal siding. The building closest to him had once been a storage depot, but now its roof sagged and graffiti covered what remained of its walls. Weller scanned the ground carefully. There were signs of recent activity. Empty footprints in the mud, cigarette butts not yet bleached by rain, and a torn scrap of newspaper crumpled against the wall. He leaned down and unfolded it. It was a Clip Chronicle article about the ongoing Zodiac investigation, dated only 2 weeks earlier. His heart pounded. He moved deeper into the facility, passing another building, then another, until he reached what had once been the communications hall. The door was ajar. Weller drew his weapon and pushed inside slowly. Sunlight leaked through a hole in the roof, illuminating dust suspended in the air. That was when he saw it. A wooden table stood in the center of the room, and on top of it, arranged with meticulous precision, were artifacts from previous crime scenes. A piece of a bloody shirt believed to be from one of the victims. A Polaroid photo of a car parked in a remote trail, believed to be connected to another unsolved murder. A scrap of fabric matching the description of a victim's coat. These items had never been publicly displayed. Only someone who had been at the crime scenes could have collected them. Weller's breath caught. This was not just a hideout. It was a shrine. He pulled out his phone to call it in, but before he could dial, he heard a soft click behind him, the sound of a shoe against concrete. He froze, then turned slowly. A figure stood at the far end of the hall, just inside the doorway. The man wore a plain jacket and dark slacks, nothing remarkable, but his eyes were sharp and cold, studying Weller with unsettling calm. Weller pointed his gun and ordered him not to move. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he almost smiled. He spoke slowly, voice smooth, as if they were discussing the weather. He asked Weller if he enjoyed the chase, if he liked feeling one step behind, if he understood that every clue had been placed deliberately. Weller's pulse raced. There was no mask, no hood, no theatrical costume. The Zodiac was standing right in front of him, and he looked utterly ordinary. The man admitted that he had returned to this place out of routine, out of attachment to his work. He said that killers were like artists, always revisiting their first inspiration, their roots. Weller took a cautious step forward, gun trained and unwavering, but the man raised his hand slightly, not in surrender but in amusement, as if proud of how close the detective had come. He spoke of the thrill of being unseen, of moving through life unnoticed, blending into crowds, listening to conversations in diners and parks where people speculated about who he might be while he sat only a few feet away. Weller tried to stall him, tried to keep him talking until backup arrived, but the killer anticipated the plan. He tilted his head and remarked that police lines were already moving toward the site. Someone had triggered a sensor or alerted perimeter security. He had only moments left before the area swarmed with officers. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, he moved. He lunged sideways toward a maintenance corridor, and Weller fired, but the bullet hit the metal doorframe as the killer vanished into the shadows. Weller sprinted after him, moving through a maze of hallways and collapsing rooms, following the echo of footsteps that moved with astonishing speed. He reached the exterior just in time to see a figure disappear into the tree line. Weller chased him but lost the trail halfway down a ravine where the ground split into multiple directions. Sirens wailed in the distance. Backup was arriving too late. The Zodiac had slipped away again. When officers finally reached Weller, he stood silent, staring into the forest. He wasn't empty or defeated. Something had changed. For the first time, he had looked into the eyes of the killer. The Zodiac was real, tangible, mortal. And Weller believed something else too. The man had not expected to be found that day. He had made a mistake, and people like the Zodiac could not tolerate mistakes. This was the first true crack in the armor. It was not victory, not yet, but a shift. From that moment, Weller knew the chase had turned. The killer was not untouchable anymore. The clock had started ticking, and now both men were running out of time. After the confrontation at the abandoned training site, Detective Mark Weller returned to headquarters with a new fire burning inside him. The fear that had troubled investigators for years had changed into something different. The killer was not a myth anymore. He was flesh and blood, able to be seen, heard, and confronted. Weller's team listened as he described every detail of the man's face, his voice, his posture, even the way he breathed while speaking. For the first time, there was a real description that did not come from witnesses who were terrified, injured, or unsure. The task force began compiling sketches, drawing comparisons to old suspects, and reopening files that had long since gone cold. Yet even with all that momentum, Weller could not shake the weight of responsibility he felt. He had stood within shooting distance of the Zodiac Killer. He had aimed, fired, and missed. There were lives now depending on what he did next. The task force doubled its efforts. They subpoenaed records, searched old employment lists, re-examined DMV data from decades ago, and reviewed archived census filings from the counties surrounding the original murders. They even went so far as to examine military rosters from the years when the National Guard site had been active. Weller remembered the killer's calm comments about returning to his beginning, to the place where he had first felt purpose. That meant he had some connection to the facility, not just symbolic, but real and personal. The deeper they dug, the more a pattern emerged. There was a widening circle of recurring names, people who had served during those years, men who had been listed as working on communications equipment, topographic operations, or cipher analysis training. From that group, only 5 matched the approximate age, physical description, and geographic presence needed to plausibly connect them to the murders. One stood out more than the others. His name was Roland Hale, a man who had once served in the National Guard as a radio operations instructor and had left active duty in the same year the first Zodiac letter was mailed. Hale had no criminal record, no citations, and no reported behavioral concerns. But his presence seemed to brush up against the outskirts of every timeline the investigators followed. He had lived in the area at the time of the murders, changed addresses with every new Zodiac wave, and moved cities abruptly around the same time the killer's correspondence stopped years earlier. It was the closest thing to a real lead the task force had ever found. Weller did not want to rush the arrest. Hale was known for being quiet, organized, and extremely private. If he sensed the police coming, he could vanish overnight. And if Hale was not the killer, pressing too fast could fracture the already delicate case. So Weller made a difficult choice. He would follow Hale personally, observe him quietly, wait for a mistake, a slip, anything that showed they had the right man. The surveillance began 2 days later. Hale lived in a small house on the edge of a valley, the kind of place no one noticed, tucked behind trees with only a narrow road leading out. He lived alone, no family, no visible social circle. Weller watched from an unmarked car down the street as Hale left every morning at precisely the same time, drove into town, spent hours in the local library reading newspapers and historical documentaries before returning home. There was nothing overtly suspicious, nothing that screamed serial killer. Yet Weller felt something off about him, something too controlled. It was a man hiding within routine. On the 5th day, something changed. Hale did not go to the library. Instead, he drove down a rural highway heading into the mountains. Weller followed at a distance, radioing his location but keeping back up far enough away to avoid alerting Hale. The road twisted through pine forests and rocky hillsides before opening into a clearing where old mining cabins remained in decaying condition. Hale parked near the largest structure and stepped inside with a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. Weller waited only a moment before moving in on foot, weapon drawn, listening carefully for sound. As he reached a broken window on the side of the cabin, he peered in. Hale stood inside, facing a desk covered in maps, cipher keys, old newspapers, and weathered journals. Weller recognized one of the journals from the crime scene table at the military site. There was no longer any doubt. Roland Hale was the Zodiac Killer. Weller stepped through the doorway and ordered him to freeze. Hale did so, slowly raising his hands but remaining completely calm, turning just enough to look at Weller. He asked if the detective felt proud, if he believed solving the case would heal anything. Weller told him he was under arrest, but Hale only smiled faintly and responded that a story like his was not meant to end in a courtroom. It was meant to live on, to linger, to become legend. Hale then gestured subtly toward a corner of the room, and Weller's eyes caught sight of something he had not noticed before. A crude explosive device sat wired to a detonator on the desk. Hale's hand twitched slightly as if he was mentally playing with the decision of whether to use it. Weller kept his gun fixed and ordered him to step away from the desk. Hale did so but continued talking in his calm voice, saying that men like him were never truly caught because people preferred the mystery to the truth. They wanted to believe monsters were unnatural, not living next door, using the same grocery stores, reading the same newspapers. Hale spoke as though his confession were a gift, something the detective should feel privileged to receive. Footsteps crunched outside. Backup had arrived and officers surrounded the cabin, weapons drawn. Hale looked at the window and seemed to understand that his time was gone. Weller reached forward, closing the distance, intending to disarm and handcuff him, but Hale made one final move. Instead of lunging for the detonator, He turned toward the nearest wall and slammed his shoulder into a support beam. The beam cracked, then split, and part of the old ceiling collapsed as dust filled the room. Hale used the distraction to sprint toward a back exit Weller had not seen. Weller gave chase, bursting out the rear door as Hale ran toward a steep drop overlooking an old quarry trench. Patrol cars boxed in the surrounding trails. Hale skidded to a stop at the edge, gravel spilling into the pit below. Weller aimed again and shouted that it was over. Hale looked back, smiling with the same unsettling calm Weller had seen at the military site, the same confidence in his own narrative. He said that stories never end when a man dies. They end when people stop looking for them. Then, before anyone could move, he stepped backward off the cliff and disappeared into the ravine. Officers rushed down the slopes, searching with lights and ropes, but the bottom of the trench was filled with jagged rock and dense debris. When they finally reached the ground, there was no body. The impact site was visible, blood marking the stone, but no corpse remained. Hale had either been dragged away by the rock movement or had slid deeper into one of the old mine shafts. Even after hours of searching, they found nothing. The medical examiner later confirmed that the fall was almost certainly fatal. Roland Hale, the man they believed to be the Zodiac Killer, had died alone in a forgotten quarry beneath the mountains. But without the body, without a confession on record, without forensic closure, the case remained officially unresolved. The press exploded with the story. Newspapers printed headlines announcing that police may have finally cornered the notorious Zodiac, but the absence of the body fueled public debate. Some refused to believe he was dead. Some insisted police had caught the wrong man. Others said the mystery was never meant to be solved and that perhaps that was the true curse of the Zodiac legacy. Weller did not speak to reporters. He spent his time reviewing every file one final time, making sure each victim's name was remembered, not lost beneath sensational headlines. He sat alone in his office the night after the search ended, staring at the evidence board. For the first time, the photos, ciphers and diagrams felt like history, not an ongoing threat. The shadow that had hovered over California for decades had finally faded. But even in victory there was no celebration. True crime rarely ends neatly. It ends with scars that those closest to it carry for years. In the months that followed, the city returned to normal life. The task force dissolved. Boxes of case files were relocated to deep storage, where only historians and archivists would browse them decades later. Weller visited the quarry once, quietly, standing at the edge where Hale had taken his final step. He did not feel triumph. Instead, he felt a strange emptiness. The work was done, yet closure was not what he expected. He realized then that this was the nature of the Zodiac story. It was never about the killer alone. It was about the fear, the pursuit, the desperation to find truth in shadows that seemed endless. Hale was gone, but the story would continue because people would keep asking questions, keep wondering how a man could live two lives so convincingly for so long. Weller eventually retired from the force. Years later, he wrote a short testimonial that would be stored with the case files. In it, he explained that the Zodiac Killer had not escaped justice even without a trial, because the moment he ran was the moment he knew the chase was over. The killer had lived his life believing he controlled the narrative, but in the end it was Weller who walked away carrying the truth. And while the world would never see the killer in a courtroom, never hear him confess aloud, the detective could accept the ending for what it was. Sometimes justice was not a dramatic capture. Sometimes justice was simply ending the story. And so, long after the public moved on, long after documentaries repeated only fragments of the real case, the memory of what happened in those mountains stayed with Weller as a reminder that even the darkest mysteries can be answered if someone refuses to stop searching.